The morning sun barely peeked through the worn curtains of James Cooper's small one-bedroom apartment in downtown Milwaukee. At 72, the Vietnam War veteran moved slowly across his living room, his right leg dragging slightly from an old combat wound that never properly healed. The walls were adorned with faded photographs from his military days, yellowed with age but preserved with care. James lived alone, surviving on a modest pension that barely covered his basic needs. His wife Martha had passed away 5 years ago, and their only son Michael rarely visited, too busy with his own life in California. The apartment, though clean, showed signs of age, peeling wallpaper, a leaky faucet, and furniture that had seen better days. Every morning, James followed the same routine. He would wake up at 6 a.m., a habit ingrained from his military days, make himself a simple breakfast of toast and coffee, and sit by the window watching the city come to life. His hands, now wrinkled and spotted with age, would shake slightly as he held his coffee mug, a souvenir from his old unit. That particular morning, James noticed his pension check hadn't arrived yet. His refrigerator was nearly empty, and the medication he needed for his chronic pain was running low. With only $23 left in his wallet, he knew he needed to visit the bank to sort out the delay. Putting on his old army jacket, the only winter coat he owned, James carefully made his way down the 3 flights of stairs. The elevator had been out of order for weeks, and despite multiple complaints to the building manager, nothing had been done. Each step sent shooting pain through his injured leg, but he persevered, just as he had done during his tours of duty. At the bus stop, a group of young office workers stared at their phones, completely ignoring the elderly veteran. When James politely asked one of them about the bus schedule, the young man barely looked up, mumbling something inaudible before turning away. This wasn't unusual. James had grown accustomed to being invisible to the younger generation. The bus ride to the bank was uncomfortable. The driver seemed irritated when James took extra time climbing the steps, and no one offered their seat despite his visible difficulty standing. He clutched his cane tightly, swaying with each turn and stop, while passengers around him remained absorbed in their devices. At the bank, James waited patiently in line for 45 minutes. When he finally reached the teller, a young woman with bright red nails and an impatient expression, she barely made eye contact. "There's nothing we can do about pension delays," she said dismissively. "You'll have to contact the VA directly." James tried to explain that he had already called the VA 3 times this week, but the teller had already turned her attention to the next customer, leaving him standing there mid-sentence. An elderly woman behind him gently touched his arm, understanding in her eyes. "It's not right, the way they treat us seniors," she whispered. Walking out of the bank, James's stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since his morning toast, and it was now past noon. The small diner where he sometimes treated himself to lunch was just across the street. He had enough for a cup of soup, and the warmth would help ease the pain in his joints that the cold weather had intensified. Inside the diner, James chose a small corner table, carefully placing his cane against the wall. The young waitress approached, snapping her gum and holding her order pad with obvious disinterest. "What'll it be?" she asked, not waiting for James to fully settle in his seat. "Just a cup of vegetable soup, please," he said politely, offering a gentle smile. "And maybe some hot water for my tea." He pulled out a tea bag from his pocket, a small economy he had learned to practice. The waitress rolled her eyes. "We have paying customers waiting. You can't just sit here all day with soup and tap water." James felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment as nearby customers turned to stare. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his cane. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, rising slowly from his seat. "I'll be on my way then." As he stepped back into the cold afternoon air, James felt the weight of his isolation more heavily than usual. He had served his country proudly for 23 years, survived countless missions, earned multiple commendations, and yet here he was, treated like an unwelcome nuisance by the very society he had sacrificed so much to protect. What he didn't know was that this day, this ordinary, humiliating day, was about to take an extraordinary turn. The afternoon grew colder as James made his way to the local grocery store. He needed to make his remaining $23 stretch as far as possible. The fluorescent lights of Save Mart buzzed overhead as he carefully selected the cheapest items: a loaf of day-old bread, 2 cans of soup, and a small carton of milk. Near the canned food aisle, a group of teenage boys were horsing around, throwing bags of chips to each other. One of them knocked into James, causing him to stumble. His cane clattered to the floor, and the few items in his basket scattered. "Watch it, Grandpa," one of the boys called out, laughing as they ran past. None of them stopped to help. A store employee walked by, giving James an annoyed look as he struggled to pick up his cane. "Sir, you're blocking the aisle," she said sharply, despite the store being nearly empty. James apologized quietly, his weathered hands shaking as he gathered his items. At the checkout counter, James carefully counted his money twice before getting in line. The cashier, a young man with bright blue hair, was chatting with a coworker about weekend plans while barely acknowledging customers. When it was James's turn, he placed his items on the belt and pulled out his worn leather wallet. "That'll be $25.47, the cashier announced, not looking up from the register. James's heart sank. He had miscalculated. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I only have $23. Could you remove the milk, please?" The cashier sighed dramatically. "Really? You got in line without enough money." Behind James, other customers began to grumble. Someone muttered, "These old people always hold up the line." Red-faced, James watched as the cashier removed the milk and recalculated. Even without it, he was still short by 50 cents. A woman behind him huffed loudly and switched to another line, making a show of her irritation. "I'll have to put back 1 can of soup too," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. The shame burned in his chest as he heard snickers from nearby customers. Finally leaving the store with just bread and 1 can of soup, James noticed a group of veterans outside collecting donations for a local shelter. He recognized one of them, Bill Parker, who sometimes attended the same VA support group. But today, Bill looked right through him, too engrossed in conversation with younger veterans to acknowledge his presence. James decided to take a different route home, passing by the local park where he used to take long walks with Martha. Near the park entrance, a community board displayed posters for various events, including one advertising a Veterans Day celebration at the City Hall next month. The poster showed young, smiling veterans in crisp uniforms, nothing like the reality James lived every day. As he paused to catch his breath on a park bench, a young couple walked by with their dog. The woman pulled her companion closer, clutching her purse tighter as they passed. James had seen that look countless times, the assumption that any elderly person sitting alone in a park must be homeless or dangerous. At the crosswalk near his apartment building, James waited patiently for the light to change. A sleek sports car pulled up, its young driver revving the engine impatiently. When James didn't move quickly enough as the light turned green, the driver humped repeatedly, shouting, "Move it, old-timer. Some of us have places to be." Back in his apartment, James placed his meager groceries in the nearly empty kitchen cabinets. His answering machine blinked with one message: his son Michael canceling his planned visit next month due to a business trip. "Sorry, Dad," Michael's voice said, sounding distracted. "Maybe around Christmas instead." James sat heavily in his old armchair, his joints aching from the day's activities. On the wall across from him hung his old service photo, a young, proud soldier standing tall in his dress uniform. Next to it was a dusty shadow box containing his medals, including a Purple Heart and 2 bronze stars. Nobody seemed to care about those anymore. As evening settled over the city, James prepared his simple dinner of soup and bread. The TV provided background noise as he ate alone, the news anchor reporting on various stories that seemed to belong to a different world, one that had left him behind. Little did James know that tomorrow would bring an unexpected visitor who would change everything. The next morning brought heavy rain to Milwaukee, making James's joints ache more than usual. Despite the pain, he needed to visit the VA office to sort out his delayed pension check. After his meager breakfast of half a slice of bread, he put on his old army jacket, which was barely waterproof anymore, and headed out. The local VA office was crowded as usual. James took a number, 47, and looked at the digital display showing number 23. He found the only empty seat in the corner, next to a water cooler that was marked out of order. The hard plastic chair made his back hurt, but he had no choice but to wait. 3 hours passed. The elderly veteran watched as people who came in after him were called before him, especially those who were loud and demanding. When he politely asked the receptionist about the wait, she barely looked up from her phone. "The system is random, sir. Please wait your turn." Finally, at 2:30 p.m., his number was called. James carefully made his way to window 5, where a stern-looking woman was typing rapidly on her computer. Before he could explain his situation, she cut him off. "If you're here about the pension delay, we can't help. The system is backed up. Try again next week." "But ma'am," James said softly, "I have bills due tomorrow, and I need my medication." "Sir, there's nothing I can do," she interrupted, already waving to the next person in line. Next. The humiliation of being dismissed so abruptly made James's eyes sting. As he turned to leave, his cane slipped on the wet floor, and he stumbled. Nobody moved to help him. Instead, he heard someone mutter, "They should have a separate line for old people. They take forever." Outside, the rain had gotten worse. James waited at the bus stop, his jacket growing heavier with water. A city bus splashed through a puddle, soaking him completely, but the driver didn't even slow down. It wasn't his regular bus anyway. Hungry and wet, James decided to try his luck at the local diner again. Different staff worked the afternoon shift. Maybe they would be kinder. As he entered, water dripping from his clothes, the hostess immediately frowned. "Sir, you're making a mess on the floor." "I'm sorry," James apologized, trying to wipe his shoes on the mat. "Could I just have a cup of coffee to warm up?" The hostess pointed to a small sign on the counter. "Minimum order $10 per customer during peak hours." It was 3 p.m., and the diner was nearly empty, but James knew arguing would be pointless. He turned to leave, his wet clothes clinging uncomfortably to his thin frame. At the grocery store next door, he thought he might at least stay dry for a while. The same blue-haired cashier from yesterday was working. As James walked past the registers, the young man called out loudly to his coworker, "Hey, it's the guy who can't count his money." Several customers turned to look, some laughing quietly. James pretended not to hear, making his way to the store's small seating area near the pharmacy. He sat down heavily, his legs trembling from standing so long at the VA office. Within minutes, a security guard approached. "Sir, these seats are for pharmacy customers only," the guard said firmly. "You'll have to leave if you're not making a purchase." Outside again in the rain, James noticed a small crowd gathering across the street. A sleek black SUV with government plates had pulled up outside the coffee shop. Men in suits were going in and out, looking important and purposeful. James watched with a hint of nostalgia, remembering when he too wore a uniform that commanded respect. Now, he was just another invisible old man on the street, soaked to the bone and unable to even buy a cup of coffee. As he turned to begin the long walk home, his stomach growling and his legs screaming in pain, he heard someone call out behind him. At first, he didn't turn around. Nobody called out to him anymore. But then he heard it again, louder this time, in a voice that seemed familiar, a voice that took him back 40 years to the jungles of Vietnam. "Lieutenant Cooper? James Cooper, is that you?" James turned slowly, rain dripping from his worn jacket, to face the voice from his past. Through the downpour, he saw a tall man in a crisp military uniform hurrying across the street from the black SUV. As the figure drew closer, James's eyes widened in recognition. General Michael Harrison, his former commanding officer from Vietnam. "My God, it really is you," the general said, quickly ushering James under his large umbrella. The general had aged too, his hair now silver, but he still carried himself with the same authority he'd had in the jungle 4 decades ago. 2 younger officers quickly appeared with additional umbrellas, shielding them both from the rain. James stood speechless, acutely aware of his dripping clothes and shabby appearance next to the general's immaculate uniform. "Sir, James began, but the general cut him off with a warm smile. "We've been looking for you for months, Lieutenant. Your old address was outdated, and the VA records." The general shook his head in frustration. "Come on, let's get you out of this rain. We have a lot to discuss." Before James could protest, he was being guided toward the black SUV. The young security guard who had just kicked him out of the grocery store stood watching, mouth agape, as James was escorted by the uniformed officers. Inside the vehicle, the leather seats were warm and dry. A young aide handed James a soft towel and a bottle of water. The general sat across from him, dismissing the aide with a quick gesture. "Lieutenant Cooper, do you remember Operation Silent Dawn, July 1971? The general asked, his voice low and serious. James nodded slowly. How could he forget? It was the mission that had given him his limp. The classified operation that had haunted his dreams for decades. The files have finally been declassified, the general continued. And there's something you need to know. Your actions that night. The real story can finally be told. James listened as the general explained how their mission, kept secret for national security reasons, had saved hundreds of lives. The intelligence James had gathered, the warning he had managed to radio despite his severe injuries, had prevented a massive catastrophe. But sir, James interrupted, confused. My service record shows that mission as a standard recon patrol. When I tried to explain at the VA. That's why I'm here, the general said firmly. The truth was buried in classified files for decades. But now, he pulled out an official-looking document from his briefcase. We're here to make it right. As James read the document, his hands trembled. It was an official recognition of his actions, along with notification of a Distinguished Service Cross award and decades of back pay that had been withheld due to the mission's classified status. There's more, the general added. The ceremony will be at the Pentagon next week. Full honors, media present. The world will finally know what you did, Lieutenant. Through the SUV's tinted windows, James could see the same people who had ignored or mocked him earlier now gathering, pointing at the official vehicle, wondering who was inside. The blue-haired cashier had even come outside to stare. Sir, I don't know what to say, James managed, his voice thick with emotion. You don't have to say anything, Lieutenant. Just be ready tomorrow at 900. We'll have a car pick you up. There's a lot of paperwork to process, and we need to get you fitted for a proper uniform for the ceremony. As the general continued explaining the details, James felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. Not just the physical discomfort of his wet clothes, but the burden of years of disrespect and dismissal. One more thing, the general added, reaching into his briefcase again. Your pension situation? Consider it resolved. This should help in the meantime. He handed James an envelope. When the SUV finally dropped James off at his apartment building, he stood straighter despite his aching leg. The rain had stopped, and the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds. The same neighbors who usually ignored him now watched curiously from their windows, wondering about the mysterious black SUV and the uniformed officers who had escorted the old veteran home. For the first time in years, James felt visible again, but this was just the beginning of his story's transformation. The next morning at exactly 900 hours, just as promised, another black SUV pulled up in front of James' apartment building. The doorman, who had never bothered to hold the door for him before, suddenly scrambled to attention as two military officers approached. Inside his apartment, James had been ready since dawn. He polished his old combat boots, even though they weren't the ones he'd be wearing to the ceremony. Some habits never died. The envelope the general had given him yesterday contained enough money to cover 3 months of expenses, but James had only used a small amount to buy necessary groceries and his medication. A crisp knock at his door revealed a young captain and a sergeant, both standing at attention. Lieutenant Cooper, sir, the captain said respectfully. We're here to escort you to the Pentagon preparation meeting. The ride to the local military base was surreal. People on the street turned to stare at the official vehicle, and this time, James sat up straight in the back seat, his dignity restored. At the base entrance, guards saluted as their vehicle passed through. Inside a private conference room, General Harrison was waiting with a team of officials. A professional tailor was present with a selection of uniforms, and a military historian sat ready with a stack of documents. Lieutenant Cooper, the historian began, spreading out photographs and maps from 1971. We need you to help us document the exact sequence of events from Operation Silent Dawn. Your perspective is crucial for the official record. For the next 2 hours, James recounted the mission in detail. His voice grew stronger as he pointed to locations on the maps, describing how his small team had discovered the enemy's hidden supply route. He explained how, even after taking heavy fire and being seriously wounded, he had managed to transmit critical intelligence that saved an entire battalion from ambush. The intelligence you provided that night prevented what would have been the deadliest attack on American forces that year, the general added. But because of the sensitive nature of the operation, everything was classified. Your heroism went unrecognized. Until now. The tailor approached next, helping James into a new dress uniform adorned with all the correct ribbons and medals he'd earned but never received. Standing before the mirror, James hardly recognized himself. The reflection showed not the ignored elderly veteran, but a distinguished soldier whose sacrifices were finally being acknowledged. "There's something else you should know, Lieutenant," General Harrison said, his voice carrying a note of pride. "Your son Michael has been notified about the ceremony. He's flying in from California tomorrow." James's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen Michael in over a year. His son had always seemed somewhat embarrassed by his father's veteran status, never quite understanding what his father had done in the war. "We've also located several members of your old unit," the general continued. "They'll be at the ceremony too. Many of them never knew the full story of what you did that night. They've been waiting years to thank you properly." A young lieutenant entered the room with lunch, not the simple sandwich James had expected, but a proper meal served with respect. As they ate, more details about the upcoming ceremony were discussed. News networks would be present. The Secretary of Defense would be presenting the medal personally. "Sir," James said during a quiet moment, "why now? After all these years?" The general set down his fork and looked James directly in the eyes. "Because it's time the world knew what real heroes look like, Lieutenant. Not just the young soldiers in their pressed uniforms, but the veterans who carried their burdens silently for decades. Your story needs to be told." As the afternoon wound down, James was given a folder containing his newly declassified service records. Pages and pages documented his acts of bravery, now finally available for the world to see. Before leaving, the general handed James a small box. Inside was a pristine name tag for his new uniform, Lieutenant James Cooper, engraved in perfect letters. "Wear it proud tomorrow, Lieutenant. The car will pick you up at 700. The ride home felt different. James sat straighter, his chin held high. Through the window, he could see the same streets where he'd been ignored and dismissed just yesterday. Tomorrow, everything would change. But even more important than the upcoming ceremony was the knowledge that after 50 years, the truth would finally be known. Dawn broke over Milwaukee with unusual clarity. James woke before his alarm, his heart pounding with anticipation. Today was the day, the Pentagon ceremony that would change everything. As he made his morning coffee, a knock at the door surprised him. It was Michael, his son, arriving earlier than expected. "Dad," Michael said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "You look different, humbled somehow. I took an earlier flight. I read the declassified files they sent me. Why didn't you ever tell me about what really happened that night?" James invited his son in, noticing how Michael's eyes lingered on the old photos on the wall, seeing them with new understanding. "It was classified," James said simply. And later, "Well, no one seemed interested in an old man's war stories." Michael moved forward and did something he hadn't done in years. He hugged his father. "I'm sorry, Dad. I had no idea. All these years?" Their emotional moment was interrupted by another knock. The military escort had arrived, right on schedule at 700. Two gleaming black SUVs waited outside. This time, the entire building seemed to be watching as James, now dressed in his new uniform, walked out with his son. The drive to the private airfield was filled with nervous energy. A military transport plane waited to fly them to Washington, D.C. As they boarded, James was surprised to see several familiar faces, men from his old unit, now aged like him, but still carrying themselves with military bearing. Lieutenant Cooper called out Thomas Rodriguez, his former radio operator. After all these years, the men gathered around James, each sharing memories of that fateful night in 1971, now able to speak freely about the classified mission. During the flight, General Harrison briefed them on the ceremony. "The President sends his regrets. He's overseas. But the Secretary of Defense will present the Distinguished Service Cross personally. Full media coverage. Your story leads the evening news." James listened, still struggling to believe this was real. Michael sat beside him, asking questions about his service that he'd never bothered to ask before. For the first time, father and son truly talked about those years. Landing at Andrews Air Force Base, they were met by a full honor guard. James's hands trembled slightly as he descended the plane's steps, but not from age, from emotion. Camera flashes greeted them as reporters gathered behind security barriers. Inside the Pentagon, James was escorted to a private room where final preparations were made. His medals were checked, his uniform adjusted. A young lieutenant helped him pin on his name tag, the same one the general had given him yesterday. Sir, the young officer said quietly, I read your file. What you did. It's what we all hope we do in that situation. You're a hero, sir. Before the ceremony, James was surprised by more visitors. Residents from his apartment building, the local grocery store workers, even the dismissive bank teller. They'd all been flown in, courtesy of the military, to witness the ceremony. Their faces showed shock and embarrassment as they realized who James really was. The blue-haired cashier who had mocked him approached nervously. Sir, we had no idea. I'm so sorry for how we treated you. James merely nodded, his focus on the ceremony ahead. General Harrison appeared at the door. It's time, Lieutenant. The Pentagon's main ceremonial hall was packed. High-ranking officers, government officials, media, and guests filled every seat. As James entered, leaning less heavily on his cane now, the entire room stood at attention. The Secretary of Defense stepped to the podium. Today, we correct an historic oversight. Lieutenant James Cooper's actions on July 12, 1971, saved hundreds of American lives. His sacrifice and heroism, classified for 50 years, will finally be recognized. As James stood at attention, listening to the details of that night being read aloud, he thought about how much had changed in just 2 days. The same people who had ignored him would now know his story. His son stood proudly in the front row, filming everything on his phone. But more importantly, the truth of what happened that night in the Vietnamese jungle would finally be known. As the secretary approached with the Distinguished Service Cross, James straightened his shoulders, ready to receive the recognition that had been half a century in the making. The Distinguished Service Cross gleamed against James's uniform as he stood at the podium. His voice, once dismissed and ignored, now commanded the complete attention of everyone in the Pentagon's ceremonial hall. The Secretary of Defense stood respectfully to his side as James began sharing his story. July 12, 1971, he started, his voice growing stronger with each word. Our 6-man recon team was deep in enemy territory when we discovered something that wasn't supposed to exist, a massive supply route hidden in the jungle canopy. The room fell silent as James described that fateful night. He explained how his team had been ambushed, how 4 of his men fell in the initial attack. Despite a severe leg wound, he and his radio operator had managed to reach high ground. Even as enemy fire rained down on their position, James had stayed on the radio, transmitting crucial coordinates. Lieutenant Cooper's intelligence prevented an attack that would have claimed hundreds of American lives, the secretary added. His actions that night changed the course of several major operations, though this information remained classified until now. Cameras flashed as James received not only the Distinguished Service Cross, but also 5 other medals that had been withheld due to the mission's classified status. His son Michael stood in the front row, tears streaming down his face as he finally understood the full weight of his father's sacrifice. After the ceremony, a special reception was held. Military officials, reporters, and guests lined up to shake James's hand. The bank teller who had dismissed him just days ago waited nervously to apologize. The grocery store staff who had mocked him stood humbled, watching as high-ranking officers treated James with deep respect. General Harrison approached with more news. Lieutenant, your story has gone viral. Every major network is covering it. But there's more. The President wants to meet you next week, and Congress is reviewing legislation about veterans' benefits in your name. James felt overwhelmed by the attention, but he had an idea forming. He asked for a moment at the microphone. Thank you for this honor, he began, but I'm not the only veteran who's been forgotten. In my apartment building alone, there are dozens of us, each with a story, each deserving respect. His words struck a chord. The Secretary of Defense immediately pledged to review how veteran services were handled. Local business owners in the audience began discussing programs to support elderly veterans in their communities. As the reception continued, James noticed a group of young soldiers standing nervously to the side. He motioned them over. Sir, one young lieutenant said, would you tell us more about that night? They're teaching about Operation Silent Dawn at West Point now. James spent the next hour sharing his experience with the young officers, passing on lessons that had been classified for too long. His son Michael sat nearby, recording everything, determined not to miss any more of his father's story. The local news crew from Milwaukee requested an interview. Lieutenant Cooper, How does it feel to finally receive this recognition? The reporter asked. It feels like being visible again, James replied honestly. But this isn't just about me, it's about all veterans who served in classified operations, whose stories were never told. As the day drew to a close, General Harrison had one final surprise. Lieutenant, we've arranged new housing for you, a proper apartment near the VA hospital, and your pension has been adjusted to reflect your full service record, including hazard pay from all classified operations. James looked around the room at the faces that now showed him respect instead of dismissal. The young security guard who had kicked him out of the grocery store was now asking for his autograph. The diner staff who had refused to serve him were apologizing profusely. But what meant the most to James was the way his son looked at him now. Michael had canceled his return flight to California, deciding to stay and help his father move to the new apartment. "Dad," he said, "I want to hear everything. Every story you never got to tell." As they prepared to leave the Pentagon, James stood straighter than he had in years. His medals caught the light, but it wasn't their shine that made him proud. It was knowing that finally, after 50 years, the truth was out. And this was just the beginning of the changes his story would bring to veterans across the country. 1 year later, James Cooper sat in his new apartment's comfortable living room, surrounded by properly framed photographs and medals. The view overlooked a peaceful park, and the building had all the amenities a veteran could need. But the biggest changes weren't in his living situation. They were in how the world now treated him and other veterans like him. The Cooper Act, signed into law 6 months ago, had revolutionized how classified mission veterans received their benefits. No longer could bureaucracy hide behind secrecy. A special committee now reviewed classified service records to ensure veterans got their due recognition and compensation. The small diner where James had once been refused service now offered free meals to veterans every day. The owner had replaced the old sign with a new one, "Heroes Eat Free," in honor of Lieutenant James Cooper. The blue-haired cashier who had mocked him now volunteered at the local VA office, helping elderly veterans with their paperwork. James's son Michael had moved back to Milwaukee, taking a job that allowed him to work remotely. Every Sunday, they had dinner together, where James shared more stories from his service years. Michael recorded everything, creating a documentary that would later be used in schools to teach about veteran respect. The black SUV that had changed everything now had company. Similar vehicles regularly appeared in communities across the country as Operation Recognition tracked down other veterans of classified missions to ensure their stories were heard and their benefits restored. That morning, James prepared for his weekly visit to the local high school where he had become a regular speaker. Students who once would have walked past him on the street now sat captivated as he shared his experiences. But more importantly, they learned to look differently at every elderly veteran they encountered. "You never know who you're passing by," he would tell them. "That elderly person you ignore might have saved hundreds of lives. They might have changed history. They might have sacrificed everything for your freedom." His building's residents had changed too. The elderly veterans who had once sat alone in their apartments now gathered in the community room, sharing stories and support. They had formed a Veterans Council that advised local businesses on how to better serve their elderly military customers. The VA office where James had once waited for hours now had a priority system for elderly veterans. The stern-faced woman who had dismissed him was replaced by a veteran services coordinator who ensured every former service member was treated with dignity. As James prepared to leave for the school, he caught his reflection in the mirror. The Distinguished Service Cross still gleamed on his jacket, but it was his straight posture and confident smile that showed the real change. The limp from his war wound remained, but now when he walked down the street, people offered assistance instead of annoyance. General Harrison called regularly to update him on the progress of Operation Recognition. "You started something big, Lieutenant," he'd say. "Your story opened the floodgates. We're finding more heroes every day." The local grocery store had transformed its policy, offering home delivery services to elderly veterans and hiring veteran volunteers to help them shop. The same security guard who had once kicked James out now coordinated these services, wearing his own father's veteran pin proudly on his uniform. That afternoon, as James shared his story with another classroom of students, a young girl raised her hand. "My grandpa was in Vietnam too," she said, "but he never talks about it." James smiled gently. "Maybe it's time to ask him again," he suggested. "Sometimes all we need is someone willing to listen." As he left the school, James noticed an elderly man in a worn military jacket waiting at the bus stop. Without hesitation, he asked his driver to stop. The old veteran was surprised when a black SUV pulled up and a decorated lieutenant offered him a ride. "No veteran stands alone anymore," James told him, helping him into the car. "That's what this whole year has taught us." The sun set over Milwaukee as James returned home, his day full but fulfilling. On his kitchen table sat invitations to speak at military academies, letters from grateful veterans' families, and a note from the president about the success of the Cooper Act. But what meant the most to James was knowing that somewhere, another elderly veteran who had been forgotten was about to be remembered. Another hero's story was about to be told. Another black SUV was about to pull up and change someone's life forever. The invisible veterans were invisible no more.